Sup everybody, and today I'm going to be making a bit of an interesting video where I'm going to be discussing on Survivor. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the top best tribals in the new era, where the best tribals topic has been widely talked about by fellow Survivor YouTubers, whether it be Peridium or the Moranian Review, where they would make videos on their top 10 favorite tribal councils, so check out their channels. But anyways, I want to do a similar kind of video with a similar topic, but this time focusing on the new era. And I'm going to do a different approach here where I'm not going to be doing a top 10. Instead, I'm going to be running through each season of the new era from 41 to the latest season in 47 and going from each tribal council chronologically and highlighting the ones that I consider the top best tribal councils of the new era. And by my personal meaning of top, I usually mean like my top or top 2 favorites. So with that would mean like I would essentially be listing out my personal top or 2 best tribal councils from each season of the new era. And for my kind of criteria on the best tribal councils, it all comes down to how insane it was, the reactions we got, and even the context that factors into the narrative of the boot. I will be excluding final tribal councils because come on, they're not eliminations. And I'll also be not including the final 4 rounds because Modern Survivor and also forced fire making is just horrendous. So that'll also be left out as well. So anyways, with that, now I can start running through every new era season and mentioning each tribal council and give prominence to the ones that I think are the best. So with what I'm going to be doing, I have to warn you that I am essentially going to be spoiling the season because I'm running through the boot order of each of them. So just a slight in advance heads up there. So with that, I can start running down the first new era season, which is obviously Survivor 41. And I know the general consensus is that this is a very mediocre season. I do tend to be a bit of a defender for it because I did have a lot of enjoyment with this season, despite the convoluted and bevy amount of horrendous twists that was affecting the editing with the season. But anyways, aside from that, let's run through every tribal. So starting off with the Abraham tribal, which is okay. I mean, just a slight blindside for Abraham, but not really that big. The Sarah tribal was kinda better. It did have a bit of a live tribal, so left a lot of things ambiguous, but by the end of it, Sarah still ended up going home, and I felt like the vote result wasn't as exciting. Next is Voce, which is kind of intriguing in a way where it was really up in the air between Tiffany, Xander, and Voce, where Tiffany was just paranoid about Xander's idol and wanting to flip the votes onto Voce. But besides that, this tribal doesn't hit those high highs, so yeah. And then same thing for the Brad vote. It's just pretty straightforward, where Brad just goes home with advantages in his pocket, which was pretty foreshown. But then we go into the JD vote, and that one was kind of in contention because Shan was able to convince JD to hand over his extra vote and then blindside him. But I felt like it was kinda obvious as soon as she did that, but it was still fun to watch the vote reveal live. Then we got the Genie boot. It was pretty unfortunate because I liked her and it was so obvious because Ricard and Shan were never breaking up at that point. Anyways, then we get to the Sydney vote, which it does make the list because the context of this is just absolutely insane where Sydney gets voted out in a 5-4-3 vote where there was a lot that contributed into this chaotic of a vote. Where Xander made Liliana misplay her knowledge is power advantage, a live tribal ensues where the votes are now going to be split among Evie and Sydney. Sydney plays her shot in the dark where if she had votes, she would have caused a tie and Evie would have gone home. But because of the insanity, she essentially got herself voted out because of it. And yeah, the most unfortunate contribution is the fact that it was because of the hourglass, because the people who were vulnerable were actually safe. But if you can put that aside, the tribal itself is insane. And also, it cultivates this amazing downfall for Sydney, which is such a glory to watch after the cockiness that she displayed throughout the first part of the merge. And I just enjoy rewatching it over and over and over again because of how chaotic it was. So it makes the list of top best tribal council. Okay, next up we got the Tiffany vote, which the vote off was pretty meh, but the lead up to it was kind of intriguing because Heather caused a live tribal trying to flip the vote onto Nasir, but by the end of it, it didn't work out. And then we got the Nasir vote, which is another one that was in contention where Shannon and Ricard help Heather and Erica blindside Nasir with an idol in his pocket, which this tribal council I do love rewatching, and it would have made the list had it not been for another subsequent tribal council that I'm about to talk about soon. And then we got the Evie vote, which was pretty mundane, where Evie had chances to be saved, whether from Xander's idol or extra vote, but he wasted it, and Deshaun was never going to flip his vote onto Liana, so there's that. But now the next tribal council makes it on to the top best, and that is the Shan vote off, which had it not been for this one, I think the Nasir one would have made the list. But now by the end of it, it was just its foundation that set up the eventual fall of Chantal's game, where She was in a majority alliance, but then her ally Ricard decided to flip the game on her and sided with the players on the bottom, and with the help of two of Shan's closest allies in Danny and Deshawn flipping, with the help of Erica orchestrating a plan to split the vote, Shan ends up being in a tied vote with Liliana where she's voted out on the revote, blindsiding her with an idol in her pocket, and this was all just crazy to watch, to see Shan, a big player, get voted out, orchestrated by her best friend in the game, really shifted the season. And nothing against Shan because she was a really great player and I enjoyed her as a villain, but I really wanted Erica to survive and I'm glad she did. And I'll just run through the last few tribals. Liana vote out was pretty foreshown as soon as Deshawn won the do or die challenge, which straight up sucks. The Danny vote off was somewhat interesting, where Erica was able to flip the vote to take out Danny instead of Deshawn after he threw some truth bombs about her at Tribal. And it was really intriguing when the votes tied, where Danny would be the one to go out on the revote. And then the Ricard vote, which was so obvious the minute that he had no sense of immunity, and although there was intrigue with Xander's idol, I mean come on, you can't let the biggest threat survive another round, you have to get him out when you need to. And I guess I'll talk about the final four fire making, even though I'm never going to include one on the list. But I'll still briefly acknowledge them just to complete the elimination order. And for this one, Heather's fire making elimination, it was a pretty close race where Deshawn would complete his near seconds before Heather does, which I know was generally dubbed as one of the best fire making challenges. It is somewhat, but I feel like because of Heather's purpling edit, it kind of impacted the suspense on who was actually going to win. But anyways, that's it for Survivor 41. Next is Survivor 42, where it's more of a highly regarded season because it had a really fantastic outcome, and I do personally agree, but I think the journey throughout the season was kind of a mixed bag. But anyways, let's run through the elimination order. Starting off with the Jackson medevac. He was evacuated because of a medical situation. He never went to Tribal. Next up is the Zach boot, and this one was just straightforward, where the only suspense it had was when Zach played the shot in the dark, but he unfortunately failed, and he was actually unanimously voted out without casting a vote at all. Then next is the Mariah vote off. I'm not picking it because it was so obvious, especially when it was between her and Marianne, where the latter was more of the entertainment one. And also, another shot in the dark was played and missed. So yeah, boring Tribal. And then next we have a Jenny boot. And I'm going to shock people that I'm actually not going to pick this one because although it had a really crazy result, I feel like there are numerous factors that kind of made me not look at it too highly to a degree. Where obviously the new era features contribute to the insanity of this Tribal. And its effect kind of went in a way where it screwed over Jenny a lot. Because Hai and Lydia were on the bottom and they didn't have the numbers to vote her out. And since Chanel and Daniel were siding with Jenny and Mike's side, it seemed like, oh, Lydia was going to be a goner. But because Mike lost a vote due to him finding up the wear advantage and Chanel stupidly risking her vote on the journey, she now lost hers too. And so left Jenny and Daniel being the only one to vote against Lydia, which has now caused a tie. And since Hai was not budging, Daniel had no choice but to flip to avoid rocks, meaning Jenny got extremely screwed over by her essential allies losing their votes when she literally had the numbers to save her. So I kind of found that part extremely tragic by the end of it. And although this was in contention, I just feel like that one aspect just swayed me not to list it. So yeah, next up with the Swati vote off. It was okay, I guess. Just Tori going into self-preservation by throwing Swati under the bus, making her allies turn on her and send her home. And Swati kind of saw it coming, so she also played her shot in the dark and failed. And then for the final pre-merge vote off, which was the Daniel boot, and although this was glorious and I actually had this in contention, I just feel like its quality just wasn't enough to list it as a top best Tribal of the season. I mean, for just brief context, it was essentially a showdown between Chanel and Daniel after they blew up their games at the Jenny Tribal, and although it was initially a tie, where Chanel put her vote on Mike just in case Daniel threw his shot in the dark, which quickly ruined her relationship with him, the vote off felt pretty obvious on the revote as Daniel met his demise. So then we got the Lydia Tribal, which this season obviously highlights the fact that it was filmed back-to-back to 41. So there was a lot of carbon copies with twists from 41 that bleeded into this season. Another one of those would be the stupid hourglass twist. So with that, it stripped the immunity away from Lydia's group and she would fall victim to the merge vote, where Omar looked at her as a flipper and orchestrated her vote off. Which, I mean, the Tribal was fine, but it felt like in contrast to the Sydney vote off, it was by far more chaotic than this one. So yeah, the Chanel vote off was very meh. She was obviously going home the minute Tori won immunity. Then we got the split Tribal, starting off with the Roxroy boot, where he was unanimously voted off over Romeo because he tried to make an all-boys alliance. And then we get to the Tori Tribal, where it was a pretty special case because there wasn't really a proper vote off due to Marianne and Drea playing their idols. And with Jonathan also having immunity, that means it was only between Lindsay and Tori. So a verbal vote commenced where everyone agreed to take out Tori, and her only choice was to play her shot in the dark, where she failed and was sent home. Then next is the High Tribal, where it's just the typical take out the big player round where everyone saw High being a big threat, so they took him out over Challenge Beast Jonathan, which the vote off was very foreshown. Then we get to the Drea Tribal, which this one was another one in contention and didn't make the list, where we got to see the downfall of Drea, draining all her remaining advantages in one tribal, starting with her knowledge is power, where Mike made her misuse it, so next he tried to use her extra vote to double the vote count against Mike, but it still wasn't enough and she was voted out with 5 votes, where she had a pretty riveting exit, but it still isn't enough to really prop this up. Now we have the Omar Tribal, and finally it does make the list, because it was just a crazy vote off, where the biggest threat in the game was voted out in Omar thanks to Marianne and her extra vote, which credits to her, and also thanks Romeo for cooperating with Marianne's plan, because with his help voting Omar, it manufactured a 3-2-2 plurality vote where Omar is blindsided, where he displays a really shocked reaction, which I really love rewatching. So with that, this glorious blindside does make it onto the list of top best tribal. So let's continue on with the next one, which is the Lindsay boot. And again, was just pretty straightforward, where the minute she lost immunity, she was out no question. And although Mike was the one who won immunity, he was never going to use his idol on her, and instead he used it on Marianne. And lastly, we have Jonathan's fire-making elimination, which the challenge wasn't even that close. It's not as intriguing. So with that, that's Survivor 42. Next up is Survivor 43, and this was a very strange season where I personally do not like it, despite it fixing the mistakes that 41 and 42 had. But I'll say, the slight amount of dynamic gameplay this season had is kind of what elevates it in a way, but I still don't find it to be that good. So anyways, let's get into the boot order, starting with the Mariah boot, where I felt like she was unfairly voted out because Ellie prioritized the guys instead, and because Janine was closer to her, she dictated the votes to send home Mariah, which I was really sad to lose her so early. Next we have the Justine boot, which was slightly better. Obviously the Justine boot felt very obvious, but there was some intrigue when Cody opened up the Beware advantage, where he essentially couldn't vote unless he followed through with the instructions, which was collecting every tribe member's bead, and he does get all except for Noelle's, so there was some suspense on whether Noelle gave hers or not, which during the vote reveal, it did show a flashback that yeah, she did, so that means Cody's vote has been restored and it helped his alliance to vote out Justine. And I will mention that even if Cody didn't vote, Justine and Noelle did split her votes, so the former would have been voted out anyways. But despite the suspense of this one, it just wasn't enough. Then the NECA vote, which was another one that's unfortunate because it was just straight up boring and she was obviously going home, which kind of sucked because she did have an interesting story. Then we got the Lindsay vote, and this was another one that was kind of in contention but did not make it, but I'll give some brief context. Lindsay was allied with James, Carla, and Cassidy, and they intended to target Gio, but Lindsay began to express her paranoia, which caused her allies to flip on her, where what was thought to be the red herring turns out to become the reality, where Lindsay is shockingly blindsided over Gio. Then we got the Gio boot, which was another one that was in contention, but couldn't scrape through, so obviously Gio was still the target despite the majority alliance flipping on one of their own. And although there was some suspense on whether they were going to do it again, this time to Cassidy, it felt too obvious that they weren't going to be this stupid to just do it again. And although Gio's boot was kinda easy to spot, I do like his blindside reaction, especially Ryan's too, so it does elevate it a bit, but not to the degree to make it onto the list. Next up is Ellie being the merged boot, where in this situation, no hourglass was in play, and so the winning team stayed immune. And yes, the tribal was very obvious on Ellie being booted. I do think her reaction to it was definitely glorious to see her downfall commence, especially Janine when she could have played her idol on her. And although I didn't really like Ellie's decisions in the game, I do like the one where she called out Gabler on her way out. Next is the Dwight blindside, which is another one that was close but couldn't make the list, where you have this insane scramble due to James finding the knowledge is power twist, so everyone kept giving their advantages to others so they could counter it, and one of those was Janine giving her idol to Dwight. And because he was becoming a powerful ally to Noelle, players wanted him gone, and they found their way to blindside him, which on the show we were under the impression that he went home with Janine's idol, adding to the mess of this blindside. And yes, after the following episode aired, it turned out Jesse got the idol, which then incentivized him to blindside Dwight so he'd keep it for himself. Next is the Janine boot, straight up boring. Then the James boot, slightly more interesting. Noel stealing Owen's vote and using it to blindside James, along with Sammy and James's closest ally Carla flipping on him, but it just didn't reach those high highs. And the same for the Ryan boot, which was kinda ho-hum, but I do like Ryan's reaction to his blindside. Then we got the Noel vote off, which was another one that was so clear, but I did like the segment with Jesse making a list on how he was gonna blindside Noel. Next is the Sammy tribal. Not really much intrigue. Sammy was obviously going home unless he's shot in the dark work, which didn't. So then we get to the Cody vote off, and yes, it does link the list of best tribal, which I think was pretty obvious. But to further gleam on it, Cody was easily playing the best game alongside his partner Jesse, but Jesse recognized how good of a game his friend has played, and because he was in possession of his idol, he made one of the biggest cutthroat decisions of blindsiding Cody while using his idol on Owen to flesh out Carla's, which was such a shocking vote off that Jesse deserves credit for. And although it was tragic for Cody, we saw a range of emotions he expresses as he recognized his best friend orchestrating his blindside. So with that makes the list, especially because 43 needed something, and I felt like this was the one that truly qualified. But I will make a nitpick to the fact that when people view like what's the best move made in Survivor 2022, obviously 42 and 43 aired that year. People voted this one to be the best, which although I do like how insane it was, I do think it gets a bit overhyped because spoiler alert, Jesse didn't even win the season. And then in comparison to Marian's move to blindside Omar, she would proceed to win the season. But anyways, let's just finish off the last few tribals. The Carla vote off was obvious. Jesse was never going to play his idol for her. He was going to do it on himself. And the only thing notable about it is the fact that when he pulled out Janine's idol and her shock reaction from the jury bench. And lastly, Jesse himself with his fire-making elimination. Roy lost fire to Gabler, who had the fastest time to make one at that current point. And Jesse had a pretty heartwarming send-off, but that was pretty much it. And obviously, fire-making is never making it to the list. So that's all of Survivor 43. The next season is Survivor 44, which, okay, this season, I might have to say this is probably the worst of the new era, because I felt like the story of a certain alliance was very foreshown, that it made the gameplay so stagnant that my experience with this season was just terrible. And especially when people look back at the season in retrospect, where they start losing their love for it because of the dull gameplay. Well, let's run through the boot order, starting off with the Bruce medevac. He got evacuated on day 1 because he hit his head on the frame, not a tribal. Next up, the Maddie boot. And okay, right off the bat, it makes the list. And yes, it felt like the edit was just all over the place that I couldn't even understand any of the characters in the tribe. But anyways, in context, Brandon found an idol and it was public, so Maddie orchestrated a vote to blindside him with it. And everyone seemed to agree, but then we get to tribal and Jamie and Matthew surprisingly played their shot in the dark, so their votes weren't casted. And Lauren didn't vote so she could get an extra vote. And then Brandon seemed to sniff out something, so he played his idol on himself, nullifying 2 votes against him. And his 1 vote sent home Maddie, the person who successfully orchestrated the votes against him, which is such a glorious immediate downfall for her. Especially for the first tribal of the season, really just started the season off with the bang, which sadly didn't last. So next up is the Helen tribal, so obvious, not that interesting. Next is the Claire tribal, where it was another one that was just so obvious, with at least one intriguing thing, with Claire playing her shot in the dark, but ultimately failing. Then we get to the Sarah tribal, and I'm gonna surprise people that I'm putting this one as a top best tribal, because I think James's reaction to the blind side is kind of what props it up, despite the fact that we lose Sarah, who is by far the most forgotten about player in the new era. No offense, but I do like the context of it in the fact that we had a 1-member swap where Josh swapped with Carson's place and he gained an idol along the way, and so Jam Jam pretty much took the lead of voting him out, and he decided to use Carolyn as the decoy vote, which definitely rubbed her the wrong way, and so she temporarily worked with Josh, getting him to use his idol on himself, and they can blindside Sarah, which is definitely a way to show Jam Jam that Caroline is someone that you do not want to use as a decoy from now on, because she'll flip and blindsides like this will happen. So with that, that's already my top 2 best tribals from this season, which goes to show why this season becomes a big downer when we get to the post-merge. But just for completionist sake, let's just run through the remaining boot order. So next up we have Matthew quitting the game because of his injury, not a tribal. Then we get Josh being the merge boot, kinda obvious. Then we have Matt being voted out in a very tragic way because of a twist where it minimized the numbers and his allies couldn't do anything to save him. Brandon getting idol out of the game when Danny played his idol on Franny, nullifying majority of the votes against her and having the Soka's votes plus Caroline blindside Brandon, which this one could have made the list if it wasn't for the fact that the edit was just so all over the place that it didn't really make anything really solid, which the same thing happened with the one coming into the Manny vote off, but the difference is that that one had at least one solid segment that made it less confusing than this one. Next up, the Kane vote off, which could have made on the list if the edit wasn't just so all over the place where I couldn't even keep up with what the heck was going on and who was the main target. So when Kane was voted out, I was just left perplexed. Then the Franny tribal, where Franny was voted out for being a comp beast, and Carolyn failed to make her blindside against Heidi, which then again, another one that had the edit just be going all over the place. Then we had the Danny vote off, which was kind of slightly better than the last three, where you have Caroline pointlessly playing her idol on Carson, only canceling out 2 votes when the tree voted 3 on Danny, which sent him out. But again, it just still didn't reach that high for me. The Jamie tribal was just underwhelming, especially how much there was hype that there was a chance that Jan and Carson were sending home Carolyn, but just don't, and Heidi wasting her idol. So yeah, pretty boring. Lauren vote off, another one that was boring, because Lauren sadly couldn't find that idol, and if she did, it would have made this one more better, but nope. And then we have the Carson fire making elimination, which similar to 43, Carson loses to Heidi, who now make the record for fastest fire, but besides that, the challenge itself wasn't that compelling, besides the fact that it sent home one of the biggest players this season. So that wraps up Survivor 44 for you. Then we go on to Survivor 45, which now the new era started a bit more refreshing, and with the help of introducing 90 minutes, it really helped bolster the quality of this season, where it now became one of the better seasons of modern Survivor. But let's get into it, starting off with the Hannah tribal, where she decides to quit because she wasn't meant for Survivor, which is obviously unfortunate. Then we got the Brandon vote off. He was unanimously voted out, especially when he couldn't vote, and the vote result was pretty by the numbers. Then next is the Sabaya tribal, and this one makes it onto the top best tribal list, because this one has just a lot of craziness factoring into it. First off, Emily was on the bottom, but Sabaya and Sean decided to flip on Caleb because he was potentially a big threat, so they planned to take him out, but Emily decided to side with Caleb and talk him into turning on Sabaya, where he was initially apprehensive of it. But at tribal, because Sabaya found the beware advantage, she found the idol inside a whack and needed fire to melt it, so she used the tribal council's fire, and when she did, she finally retrieved her idol. And at the voting booth, it revealed that if she sacrificed her vote, then she could expand the idol life for a few more rounds, and she chose to do so, which would essentially be her nail in the coffin, as without her vote, Caleb and Emily's 2 votes sent her out with the idol in her pocket, which is absolutely hectic to see. This big player in Sabaya getting taken out right away after her attempted flip against Caleb, and also her essentially getting herself voted out when she could have saved herself had she not sacrificed her vote, which adds to the level of craziness with this tribal, and that's why it qualifies as one of the best tribals in the new era. Next we have the Sean tribal, where he asked everyone to vote him out, which was just underwhelming to see, especially since it would have been better if he didn't ask that and the players went through with their blindside plan on Sifu, but oh well. Then we have the Brando vote off, which was those typical 3-2 close votes where Brando ends up getting voted out. But I felt like the presentation of the vote out didn't really feel exciting to me, so yeah. Then next up is the J Maya tribal, where she gets very unfortunate, where Caleb was the consensus target and he was unanimously about to get voted out, but he played his shot in the dark, and for the first time, it worked, nullifying all the 11 votes cast against him, meaning J Maya was essentially screwed over on the revote, as she was the secondary target, despite her efforts trying to flip the votes on Emily. But I feel like the reactions to it was pretty lackluster, and why it doesn't scrape in onto the list. Next is the Sifu tribal, which is just straightforward. The minute he was vulnerable and no one was asking to quit, he would just be taken out like that, with no real hype. And then the Caleb tribal, which was just more unfortunate than fun. And I'll be honest, the intrigue was kind of sapped when we got that flash forward from Jake's confessional, because that would mean it was obvious that it was not going to work out, and that the votes weren't going to tie, and Kentora was just going to straight up vote out Caleb, which she did. So then afterwards, we get to the Kelly tribal, which qualified for the best tribal list because it's just everything that we would need from a new era tribal. A shocking blindside with some great reactions and a big player being sent home. I mean, yeah, for the story, after Jake failed his big move to save Caleb, he was on the bottom alongside Bruce, where when he won immunity, Jake was essentially a dead man walking, but the Rebus plus Emily decided to make a big move and take out Kelly, who was a big player on the other side. Plus she had a shared amulet alongside Austin, who wanted it all himself. So with that, Kelly was ultimately blindsided at this tribal, with her and Kendra's completely shocked reaction as the votes against the former came up, which this by far deserves to be highlighted as one of the all-around great tribal councils in the new era. And I should also mention, Jake played his shot in dark in this tribal and failed, so it added to the suspense of this insane blindside. So that's it for my top best tribals from this season, so we'll quickly run through the last remaining tribals. Kendra Vodoff was just obvious, especially when the round was ruined by the twist where 3 people lost their votes with only 1 restoring theirs. Bruce Vodoff was foreshown, and the only suspense was there is if he was going to play his idol or not, and even if he did, it would have led to a boring Jake Vodoff because he was the split vote target. Emily Tribal was pretty big, and it would have made it onto the list if it hadn't been overshadowed by the Sabaya and Kelly tribals. But here, we have Emily, the last Lulu left, playing such a big game, and Julie, who was really well liked, was becoming a big target for her social game. And with Austin essentially giving one of his idols to her, everyone wanted to take that chance to flush it out by voting her out. But Dee did not want that, so she was going to go along with the majority's plan. But behind her back, she secretly informed Julie to play her idol and vote for Emily, and which she followed through with, which was pretty unfortunate because Emily was a big character and her redemption story could have lasted longer, but oh well. Then we got the Drew blindside, which was another one that was pretty intriguing, but just was overshadowed by the other great tribals, with Austin misplaying his idol and Drew being voted out, with Austin being the only one left out of the vote. Then we got the Julie tribal, which is another overshadowed great tribal that could have qualified and had not been for the ones that I had just listed. But to dwell into it, it was an insane 2-1-1-1 vote, where Jake misplayed his idol on Katora, and Dee nearly getting taken out, but because of Katora not trusting Jake, she flipped her vote on Julie and sent her home instead, which I think the result is kind of lame, and had Katora actually voted Dee, this would have changed the trajectory of the season completely. And then lastly, with the Katora fire-making elimination, it's just on par with those typical forced fire-making challenges, where in this one in particular, it was just a nice way to redeem Jake's arc where he was just failing over and over and over again, and for him to finally overcome his failures was at least nice to see, but doesn't even elevate this tribal at all, even though it would never make the list at the slightest. But anyways, that's it for Survivor 45. Then next up, we have Survivor 46, which is another refreshing season where, straight up, I do get why it does get boring a bit because at the beginning, it was such a slog, but after that, the season started picking itself back up and we started getting one of the most insane high highs we could get this season. But let's get into it. The Jelinski tribal, which is definitely in contention because it was such a glorious downfall for Jelinski, especially since I wanted Jess to survive and my heart was pounding for her to do so. But yeah, the Jelinski downfall was just everything I wanted at the premiere, and especially a strong start to the season, despite it slowing down in the next few episodes. So had it not been for other tribals down the road, this tribal wouldn't be overshadowed, but unfortunately it did. Next is Jess tribal. Straightforward result, with only minor interest coming from Jess's fake idol play, but besides that, it didn't even matter. She was going home no matter what. Brandon gets medevac out of the game, not even a tribal. Next off, the Bonu tribal, where there wasn't even a proper vote because it was so obvious Bonnie was going home that the editors and players couldn't even hide the fact. So yeah, pretty dull. The Gem tribal. She goes home with an idol in her pocket. Kind of foreshown in a way, and not really presented in an interesting way, besides the aspect of Maria using her extra votes right away to cast 2 votes against her. Mariah, being the merge boot, was another boring one because it was super clear she was going home, which she played her shot in the dark and failed, meaning she goes home. Tim tribal, a bit better, but I felt like the edit was kind of all over the place where I couldn't really care enough with Tim's downfall, so yeah. The Soda tribal had a little bit more interest. Soda had a fun reaction to her blindside, but besides that, the vote result was just foreshown. Then we go to the Tevin tribal, and it does indeed qualify for best tribal because of how insane it was, all stemming from Q wanting to be the martyr, trying to beg everyone to vote him out, leading to a live tribal where everyone is just left perplexed by Q's antics. So then they go to vote and Tevin is the one blindsided, which he gave such an awesome blindside reaction, especially since he's leaving with an advantage in his possession. And I think it's all because of Q that made this tribal notoriously great. So then we move on to the Hunter tribal, which was pretty suspenseful, but just wasn't big enough to really qualify. Obviously, in this tribal, we normally have Jeff pulling out popcorn to eat in front of the contestants and giving them some to munch on. And then we have the vote result where Hunter was threatening to use his idol but proceeds to not do it and ends up in a tie with Q where he is sent home on the revote, with now him going home with an idol in his pocket. Then we go to the Tiffany tribal, and surprise surprise, this one lands in the category of best tribal for me because although I felt like the vote off was kind of straightforward in a way, I do think the reaction was just entertaining. To see that face drop on Tiffany when a second vote against her came up, and then obviously Kenzie's shock expression, considering she was indeed willing to flip on Tiffany but backed out. So it's funny to see her reaction and give this "oh my god, they still went for it" impression. And funnily enough, when it comes to the voting aspect, where it was between Tiffany and Q, and the fact that Liz, the person who literally yelled at Q, ends up being the vote that saved him, makes this tribal more mind-blowing when you think about it in the context. But anyways, Tiffany is blindsided and goes home with an idol in her pocket. Then the Venus tribal, where it does kind of peter out the injury since it was sort of foreseeable as soon as Charlie changed his mind on Venus and wanted to get her out. And the only interest came from whether she was going to play her idol or not, and which she doesn't. And so with her going home, that marks 3 people in a row being eliminated with an idol in their pocket. Then we got the Q tribal, where there's really no suspense at all, and especially since they pulled a little bit of an Eric Reichenbach situation where all the votes were shown before Jeff revealed them. And because of that, it only led to one intrigue on whether Q would play his idol or not, and once he didn't, us viewers knew he was going bye-bye. And with Quintavious going home with an idol in his pocket, he became the 4th one in a row to do so, which was such an insane stat this season made. And I think it's probably the biggest landmark this season is going to be known for, with the bevy amount of people going home with idols in their pockets, where none of them were ever played at all. So then we got the Maria tribal, which was just whatever. It was obvious the minute she lost immunity. And lastly, the Liz fire-making elimination, where the challenge itself wasn't even that close. So that concludes Survivor 46. And lastly, to the latest season in Survivor 47, which obviously I did talk about, and I think this was an amazing season, with a riveting journey, and made this three-peat for good modern seasons of Survivor. So running from the order, John Tribal had a very easy result, nothing of note. TK Tribal, kind of foreshown as well. Minor interesting aspect was when Gabe played the idol on himself. In a case that rock draw occurred, he wouldn't be eligible for it. Asia Tribal, kind of insane in a way. Rome saved himself with an idol. Teeny casting her vote on Saul, while her alliance chooses to send home Asia. Just doesn't hit those high highs as much, especially since later tribals stand out more, which we'll talk about. Kishan Tribal does deserve some highlight because it is just an insane downfall for Kishan after he attempted to put on his villainous side to blindside Rome, only for it to backfire because of Genevieve, where she ratted out to Rome, and with him in possession of a steal vote, he took away Kishan's vote, meaning he couldn't even play the shot in the dark even if he was spooked. But yeah, a unanimous Kishan vote, where his reaction to his demise was just entertaining, and it really much is the only one that stood out a lot in the pre-merge. Okay, onto the Annika tryout, which although the result was obvious, I think the reaction to that was very remarkable, where Annika was just super incredulous on her vote out and was questioning everyone on her way out. Rome, another one that was obvious, and I was kind of disappointed that his blindside reaction wasn't as notable as Annika's, where if he was just more in shock instead of the typical, oh, good game, guys, I think it would have propped up this tribal a bit more. So yeah, Tiana tribal, not even interesting of a result. And also the down twist from 44 came back, which minimized the numbers there. Sierra tribal was decent enough. Rachel playing her shot in the dark to gauge reactions and doesn't play her idol. Sam and Sierra ending up in a tie vote, where the latter is the one voted out. But I just think it didn't have the gravitas to make it fully qualify as one of the best New Era tribal councils. The Saul tribal had a crazy scramble, but a lame result by the end of it. Gabe tribal on par with Saul, a scramble that just led up to a straightforward result. Kyle tribal, very obvious and dull. Players would be such idiots to let him slide after winning 4 immunities. Caroline tribal surprisingly didn't qualify, where Operation Italy was definitely a big move, but I feel like one that I'm going to talk about later actually overshadowed it because it just felt more ceremonious than this one, where in this one, we obviously have a majority alliance where Sam and Genevieve are 2 people on the bottom, and so there's going to be a split vote among them. However, Andy is willing to flip, and his 1 vote flipping can send one of his alliance members home, and Caroline ends up falling victim to that. But I felt that something about this tribal didn't really feel grander compared to the one that I'm about to talk about, and that being the Annie tribal, which ends up making its way onto the category of best tribal because I felt like it was more grander and had such a glorious result where Andy got the comeuppance of his big move, kinda in a way where really he was mostly sent home after spilling his game to Rachel, where he assumed that she was going to get eliminated and was going to be on the jury advocating for him, not knowing that she was in possession of an idol that she was automatically playing that night. And with him laying out his game to her, he essentially offered himself to be Rachel's new target over Sam, because if it wasn't for that, Sam would have probably went home. But because Andy did this, it allowed Rachel and Sue to put their votes on him and blindside him after Rachel idols him out, which I feel like I was way more enthralled with this vote off than the previous one. And plus, the lead up to the vote was very intriguing with the whole notion of this being Rachel's funeral, essentially where she was looked at as the biggest threat left in the game and was finally meeting her impending elimination, and so the players fought, which added to the existential irony going into this vote, and it made things more exciting when awaiting for their imminent blindside reactions once Rachel would pull out her immunity idol and they'll have all this hubris they have blow up in their face. So then next up we had the Genevieve trial, where I like how it wasn't as foreshown as I could have been because of the narrative of her idol, even though it's fake. So it did add some sense on whether Sam was about to be voted out to counter Genevieve's idol, or she was going to be sent home in hopes that she wouldn't play her idol. And although this trial didn't really qualify, it was one that I was very interested in and had some moments leading up to it that props him up a bit more. And finally, Teeny's Fire making elimination, which we all know these final 4 rounds is never gonna qualify, but I will say the challenge itself was way more suspenseful because both players had a fire going that was touching the rope, but because of a gust of wind that blew over Teeny's fire, Sam's was able to stay on top and win the challenge. So that completes everything of Survivor 47. And that's all my picks for the top best tribal councils from the new era Survivor seasons. And looking back at the picks for each season, it feels like it also characterizes and contextualizes the season as a whole, where I'm going to go through a brief reflection on my picks for each season. Survivor 41, it was the Cindy and Shan tribals, where there, it felt like they highlighted that the season was highly dictated by shifts, where it seems that the trajectory of the season would change its pacing after these two respective tribals. Next, Survivor 42, it was only the Omer tribal, where maybe besides the Jenny tribal, which I didn't pick, it felt like this season was ran by a power player who needed to be sniped out at some point, and Marianne would pull that off, where once she got rid of Omer, it would change the trajectory of that season's endgame. Then Survivor 43, where it only had one pick as well, which was the Cody tribal, and it definitely contextualizes that the season was a pretty average season that was just needing a big moment to be remembered by, and the Cody tribal sets an example of that. Survivor 44, which had 2 picks that were both in the pre-merge, where both victims in Maddie and Sarah were idled out, which both tribals required some game twists that affected them. It elicits that 44 was a season barraged with advantages, and that despite the lackluster pre-merge, it essentially had the only interesting tribals that occurred because the post-merge was just so dull. And then next we have Survivor 45, where the picks were the Sabaya and Kelly tribals, and I think those two exemplify that this season was in the alley of big moves, where the big players who are on this list get sniped out in a huge blindside that really epitomizes the norm with big moves that Survivor always entailed. Then for 46, where I chose the Tevin and Tiffany tribals, where it feels like they were blindsides, where the lead up to it was way more riveting than the vote result itself, besides their reactions to it. And it stems from where the context that led up to these two tribals were just mind-blowing and insane, which is in line with the element of Survivor 46. And in general, characterizes how 46's mid-merge was the peak of its season, because obviously the pre-merge was very mediocre. So these two tribals really propelled this season into its higher highs. And then lastly, Survivor 47, where the Gashawn and Andy tribals were ranked on the list, where they were mostly dictated by advantage plays. However, they were both really good tribals, where it led to some glorious downfalls for the two casualties, especially stemming from their display of overconfidence coming into the tribal, where they both wouldn't expect their imminent downfall occurring soon, which adds to the enjoyment. And overall, emphasizes on the consistent ride with this season. And that wraps up everything for my coverage on the best tribals of the new era. So with this all being said, I do look forward to making more topics related to Survivor or any other reality shows that I'm going to be watching. So they'll be coming soon, and I appreciate everyone for tuning in. Thank you very much.